to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend respect to all First Nations people here today. Floating Land is a truly iconic cultural program, not just here in Noosa, but across Australia and internationally. Today's conversation brings us full circle, connecting the roots of this project with its vibrant present. And it's a privilege to welcome Kevin Wilson, the founder of Floating Land, back then in 2001, who planted the seed of this unique environmental art event, 24 years ago. And it's equally a pleasure to welcome Michael Brennan, the curator of this year's edition, Floating Land Escape Making, who has continued to evolve the Biennale. And both of these creative curatorial minds have shaped how we think about art, place, ecology, and community here on the Sunshine Coast. So today's event, as Kevin explained, is part of Come Together Right Here, Right Now, a very exciting series of events programmed by the Artist in Nature International Network. And this satellite program here in Kinkin has added a rich layer of global perspective and collaboration to Floating Land Escape Making. And it's a very timely reminder of the power of art to connect people across borders, but also rooting us deeply here in place. So thank you all for being part of this moment. It's a moment to reflect and reconnect and also imagine what's next. So please join me in welcoming Kevin and Michael as they take us through the story of Floating Land now and then. Give them a clap. Now the way this is going to run today is there'll be a bit of a 40-minute panel, and then we'll also open it up to questions from the public. We have had a little technical glitch, so we're going to be sharing mics, so please bear with us while we lean across each other to get the mics. So Kevin, I'm going to start with you. Take us back to 2001. What inspired you to initiate Floating Land, and what were the original intentions behind bringing artists and the natural environment together in this way?
Thank you. Basically, there's a man in this room who's sitting just over there, Francois Devine, who was my inspiration for Floating Land, essentially. But basically, I got involved in, Noosa Council at that particular stage, like it is now, is very much looking at how it responds to nature in all its kind of roles, not just in the arts, but in a whole range of things. And when I was running the Noosa Regional Gallery at that stage, I was trying to work out how we could develop something that related to the kind of concepts that the council was pushing. And I ended up, I won't go into the long story, but I ended up in Germany, meeting various people and being at a conference, which was almost a very, originally I thought it was a big conference, but it was in a little community hall. I met a whole lot of artists, including Francois, artists from Sweden, Malta, a whole range of places, Korea. And we ended up going back to the woman's house who organised it, slept in her house on the floor. We all kind of ate together. At the end of the weekend, we decided that we would form an organisation, which was Artists in Nature International Network. Post that, I came back with an Australia Council grant to work in a number of projects in Europe, particularly Le Vent de Forêt, which is in the eastern side of France, in a little village called La Hamé, and working with Francois. I'd been to a number of other projects, but I worked with that project. And what really inspired me about that project was the fact that artists were drawn from all around the world. They put their proposals in. The farmers who lived in the town, or representatives of them, plus a curator from Paris, came and made the decisions on who should be doing being involved in the project. So there wasn't that kind of, we've only got so much money for this person, we won't bring that person. So people from wherever they came from were selected. and then, because there weren't names, and then also I think Francois at that stage, a lot of the payments for the artists were in kind of things like machinery, like chainsaws and computers and a range of things, you know, again, a sponsorship thing. But all the artists lived with the farm, within the farms, with the farmers, and the farmers also helped the artists make their work. And then there was lots of celebrations every night in the Maris, which is the town halls of the town. And I was quite inspired, but I worked there, I helped out basically, I wrote stuff for all the artists, but I just learnt the process, and so I was inspired by that particular project. So when I came back to Noosa, I decided to do something like floating land, and Le Vent de Forêt is the winds, it's translated as the winds of the forest. The wind, yeah. So I liked the idea of that kind of titling, and so floating land was like, well, you know, the land's floating, it's part of the water, it was just that nice poetic thing. And so I did the same thing. So basically, I created the same process where we selected artists. So I think I had the guy who drove the ferry along Noosa River as a person selecting. I brought Tim Morrell from Brisbane, who's now deceased unfortunately, but he came up as a curator. And then I think we had another local person who was an artist. And we did the same as what Francois did in Le Vent de Forêt, which was we picked people. We didn't know where they came from. We just said, okay, we like that project. And so in the end, we had people coming. We had one artist who came from Peru, which was like $5,000 worth of travel, you know, number of flights to get there. But we made that decision to kind of keep that model. And the idea of that particular floating land was to work, again, in water, on water, or near water, or underwater. So it played with that notion of water. So that was the very first one, and that model, pretty well I kept this, to some extent, I modified it. As you do projects, you modify them. But anyway, that's probably best if I leave it at that.
So how was the relationship between art, place and community envisaged in those early days? And was it more about environmental awareness or artistic experimentation or both?
Yeah, I think it was a bit of a mix. I mean, we did in terms of community, we did the same as Le Vent de Forêt. We actually had community dinners in some of the community halls around Noosa. There were a lot of issues around environment that came up with the artists working, dealing with the environment, issues like certain trees that were endemic that were used in certain ways as a kind of comment. But I think all the artists basically worked with the environment in some way or other pretty well, either using... I mean, I did find a lot of the European artists used a lot of bamboo, which wasn't necessarily totally related to the place. And mainly that was a building thing, you know, like, oh, you know, we've got to make this work, oh, I need bamboo, I'll make it quickly, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of the artists did explore, but in the first one we actually had, it was all around Noosa. Like, it wasn't just in one location, we ended up having to have a bus to take visitors around because it was right out in the hinterland and back into Noosa, and they found places that were quite interesting environmental places. They were and places I had never even been to. You know, it was quite interesting, that process. But yeah, it very much about the environment in the first ones. And some of it was quite nature-based art, but others were a lot of comments like floating house structures on the lake that, you know, talked about housing and the environment.
Okay, Michael, don't think that you're sitting there and not going to get spoken to. This one's a question for you. Over the years, floating land has grown and shifted, and artistically, conceptually, and also logistically. From your curatorial perspective, how has the event evolved? And what have been some of the significant turning points in your experience?
Thanks, Tony. It's kind of interesting because I moved up here from Melbourne 7.5 years ago to take on the job of the director of Noosa Regional Gallery, and I hadn't encountered floating land before then, so my first floating land was one that I was tasked with delivering. And it became apparent to me really quite quickly how invested the community, the artistic and creative community in particular, but the community more broadly, was in this event that Kevin had founded and nurtured. But also that the story of it, the history of it, the recollections of it were quite varied as well. There wasn't a singular documented history. And it's interesting when you hear Kevin talk about how those early iterations were spread out across the region. I would say, I'm going to pluck 70% out of the air, but 70% of people who talk to me about floating lands says it started at Boring Point, and it was always at Boring Point, and it should always be at Boring Point. So, it's funny how we remember things and think about things. How it has evolved, well, it's kind of difficult for me to answer in that I didn't experience the first, what are we, I think this is the 13th, so I did the 13th, 12th, 11th and 10th. So the first 9, I didn't have any first-hand experience of, only through catalogues and documentation. But what I embraced from what I'd heard from others and speaking to people is it was about, the best of floating land was about site-responsive projects. And I think that's a little bit different to site-specific projects sometimes. It can incorporate site-specific projects, but I think it's about entering into a conversation with the sites where the works are, whether that's physically and materially or conceptually as well. Importantly, I think that makes sure you're shifting away from what people call plonk art, shifting away from what other kind of outdoor sculpture events might do where, you know, there's a specified site and the works could appear anywhere on that site, because, you know, I'm talking about, I suppose, some of these large events which span kilometres along beach sides and things like that, where it's not particularly important what part of the beach side that your work appears on. But the other really important takeaway for me was these were projects that we were delivering which embraced the identity and the values of the community and the artists that lived here, and were a really important and authentic expression of that. Not to say that it only had to be artists from this region, but artists who came into this region certainly embraced that outlook and embraced those values and that identity. But also projects that left no physical trace on the environment at the end of the event. So that was some of the values which I really tried to carry through. But from a curatorial perspective, you know, I acknowledge that I'm in a really, you know, privileged position in that I get to choose how much of the agenda and how much of the conversation I'm going to put forward. And I think the important part of the role of someone like myself or Kevin is being aware of what artists are doing, whether it's locally or artists more broadly, and what's interesting them, and also being aware of the conversations and the ideas that are being thrashed out across communities and across societies and across nations and across the world, and working out all the kind of ideas that unfold in between those artists and in between those communities and in between those nations, and seeing how they resonate with the original ideas of the project and how they can be site responsive. So for me, that kind of background collided with a conversation that I've had with James Muller, a video artist who's been involved in floating land a number of times. And one of the things he said that's always stuck with me was that he's never sure how to explain what floating land is, and the fact that it shifts and moves and is mutable and is so unexpected. So I've really lent into that, I guess. It's kind of a similar philosophy that I program Noosa Regional Gallery with, and that is we've got kind of a finite physical environment, whether it's inside the gallery or inside this local region, and I think the death of any gallery or any artistic program is to try and do the same thing over and over and over for 25 years, which we're approaching at the moment. So to surprise audiences, give them new experiences visually, but also conceptually as well. And so while I've tried to maintain the resonance with environmental themes through floating land, I've been really willing to cast the net wide on what those ideas that might intersect with the environmental themes are.
Okay, I'm going to segue to another question on environmental things. So there's obviously been quite a number of changes in environmental discourse over the 20 years of floating land, from climate change to sustainability and resilience. And I suppose I'm interested in how these shifting environmental discourses have shaped the kinds of works or themes that appeared in floating land. So it might be great to hear from you, Kevin, and then maybe pass over to Michael.
It's an interesting one. I mean, I did 3 floating lands, and I mean, there was always this issue of the environment, but it was more about being in the environment. You know, there wasn't that didactic thing, except for a couple of ones that I mentioned before, like trees being changed into rockets and a comment on war and environment and damage. But generally I felt that it was more about being in nature, and I don't think, and artists today are still doing that. You know, there are some very didactic environmental works that happen, but I do think a lot of artists want to understand their relationship to nature, but you know, the materials they use can be very specific and can actually make comments. You know, I think like something like Robin here, who at Greenfields with her sculptural work using the materials, the kinds of materials that she uses, detritus and kind of found, you know, washed up environmental materials. But I don't know. I'm just going to go back to what Michael was saying about curating. I mean, we're crazy. We're curators. You know, our mental brain is about what kind of event we're going to create. You know, so I think with flooding land, I wasn't thinking so much about the political thing. It was more what came out of the first project, what came out with Francois, is this community building concept rather than, you know, didactic kind of comments. It was about the community coming together. And yes, you know, we tried different things. We tried one like that, the first one. The second one was more technology, using all the things that we use for tech, and, you know, and jumping mountains, doing flashing lights from one mountain top to the other, performances on the top of mountains. And then the third one was like in one location at Noosa, at the end of Hastings Street. And that again came back to the first one, which was about artists coming back to eat, and the community coming and talking to the artists. So it was much more focus for me about that, even though artists used the environment and made environmental comment. It was more about the community, you know, and people being able to talk to artists, being able to eat with them and so forth.
I don't know how to answer that question other than the first thing that jumped to mind for me was in 2023, the theme of floating land was floating land, us and them, and I would hazard a guess that that's probably the furthest it's conceptually strayed from the origins of floating land. But interestingly as well, I think it was about responding to the social climate at the time. In particular, we'd just come through COVID, or we're still experiencing the tail end of COVID, and there was so much divisiveness in our communities from, you know, the obvious one at the time was those who believed that vaccination was the way to go and those who believed that it certainly wasn't. But there was we also had this, you know, exponentially growing virtual world of Twitter and Instagram and all these kind of social media platforms where it was so easy to just surround yourself by people who agreed with your position and forget that everyone else had different opinions to you. And we kind of realised that this was something that was really happening in society, and it was more pronounced than probably ever before. But also the fact that divisiveness was often the thing that led to environmental peril, you know, people looking after and chasing self-interest for their own benefit, and it was always the environment that suffered. So we used these divisive relationships in society as a starting theme, which could then be used to unpick further kind of what the environmental impacts might be. And just at the end of the day, people are part of nature too, and how we treat each other is as important as how we treat the natural world, or what we call the natural world in inverted commas. But then also, as I said before, I think part of my, as curators, we bring our own subjective lens to these projects as well, and it's impossible to be purely objective about it. So you kind of bring your own history of how you think about the world and how you think about creative practices to this project. And I'm not sure how it happened, but mine has tended to be through a slightly left-leaning political lens a lot of the time. And when an artist presents a project in front of me that resonates with that, it excites me. And so they tend to often get a Guernsey in some of the projects that I'm responsible for putting together. This year's theme, escape making, was a lot of the mechanisms for putting it together was a deliberate rebellion against what we did in 2023, which was a completely tap on the shoulder curated artistic program. And this year we wanted to go back to an expression of interest process for large parts of the program, just to do something different and not fall into that trap of giving people the same expectations about what they were going to experience. But that said, we also had what was going on in the news cycle at the time, and I mentioned in the opening remarks I made last weekend at Floating Land that at the time Elon Musk was all over the news, as he tends to still be, but at that time it was all about building rockets and escaping to Mars so we could colonise another planet. So it seemed absolutely absurd to me that we've got this planet here in the Goldilocks zone, as they refer to it, but this guy with all this cash thought the better idea, as opposed to kind of mending what we've done here, is to disappear to somewhere else and probably repeat the same problems again. I've got a sense I've strayed quite far from the original question here, Tony, but...
I want to bring you back, but that's why it's not good to have one mic.
Excellent, I'll pass it back to you then.
I am going to bring it back to people though, because I think at the heart of what both of you have been speaking about is this idea of collaboration. It's always been a big part of Floating Land, and I'm really interested in the relationships you have with like First Nations artists and local communities and this international network that are here, and how that's shaped the event's direction. So again, I might start with Kevin and then pass over to Michael, and just on theme, Michael, okay. Collaboration.
Well, the first point I would make would be, and it was interesting, we were talking about local artists and their role in Floating Land. I think the very first Floating Land, a lot of artists thought, why are you bringing all these international artists here? What about us? And I'm sure when you run a regional gallery, you get that a lot, you know, like, it's all about us, not about bringing all these other people. But I always believed that bringing other people in from outside was always a good idea, especially with different experiences. And I think, well, from the first one, a number of local artists ended up making friends with these international artists, going to France, doing projects outside of Noosa. And I think that was one of the best things about Floating Land, it opened people up. The other thing really, in terms of First Nations, it was very difficult. You know, we did have in the first one, I forget his name because he never came. It was a gallery director who organised it, but it became a little bit like plonk art, and I was a bit disappointed in it. I would have liked to have actually had more, you know, kind of a direct response with someone and work with them and really allow it to happen, but it didn't happen that way. It was almost, they were projects put up and they were accepted and they were, you know, and it just happened. I think though the community issue for me was it's always been an important part of what I do, is how do people relate to art, you know, how do communities relate to art. And I mean, even at the Butter Factory, Cooroy Butter Factory, you know, and that's a community art centre. I mean, I don't judge it on any kind of terms of it's great art or not great art. It's about the community. And one of the projects we did there is called Art Jam, and it was only developed because people come into a gallery and they go, I want to talk to an artist. I don't want to just walk around a space. You know, it's a totally different model. I've worked in all kinds of models, but Floating Land and any kind of outdoor project, it's still about people for me. And how do you make that work? You know, it's not easy. I mean, even this project, we've had all these free workshops. You know, they're free, and people still don't come. So you know, it's almost like you have to put a big price on something for people to come. And yeah, so it is hard. You are corralling people all the time to get them involved in the arts, and sometimes something happens where it's an amazing event, and then other times there's no one. So yeah, it's an interesting process.
So there's a couple of interesting things I think to say about First Nations involvement, and the first thing I'd say, I agree with Kevin that it can be hard, particularly in an area when you want to work with traditional owners in particular, and the population size of that group is so small, and then even smaller within that group are the people who actively practice art. You could almost count on one hand really the number of people who are regularly appearing in artistic programs across the Sunshine Coast who identify as Cubby Cubby. So marrying that with the idea that you want to keep an event fresh and new and bring in new artists each time is incredibly difficult. And for the first 3 floating lands that I've been involved with, we've worked with Lyndon Davis and in his collaborative projects with Leah Barclay from UniSC and her sound art projects. And they've been fantastic. I've enjoyed all of them. And we continue to work with Lyndon in different ways with the Gubby Gubby dance troupe and his Welcomes to Country, which are endlessly entertaining and informative. He's just such a charismatic person. So I can see no end in the foreseeable future to that kind of relationship. But we did make the deliberate decision this year not to invite Lyndon back to make a project with us, because we did feel we were perhaps telling the same stories and very similar works each time. Thankfully, his niece, Zartisha Davis, who has a really interesting, more emerging practice, was interested in coming on board with us. So we've been able to have that voice represented there and that culture represented there. Also, we're certainly not averse to the idea of working with First Nations people and First Nations artists from outside of the region, but we also always like to lead with creative projects by Cubby Cubby artists if we can, given that floating land happens in the most visible part of being on country. I guess it's so important. So it's a challenge which we're really happy to meet, but it is a challenge which we're always grappling with in an evolving way. The next little bit I wanted to say kind of links back to your first question, Tony, and that was, about significant turning points in floating land, I guess. And I see that as kind of keying in also with significant milestones or significant events or significant projects. And anyone who's familiar with the history of floating land would probably be really familiar with one of the most iconic photographs, which involves Lyndon Davis standing out in Lake Catharaba with a didgeridoo, with some clay kilns out there as well, smoke coming out of them, built by Rolly Drysdale and a bunch of other ceramicists from across the region too. Rolly will always put his hand up as being the leader in that group. It was well before my time, so I can't buy in on that conversation, but I know there was a number of other ceramicists who were... Alan Appleby as well. But I only know that project through the photograph, and people love that photograph and people love that event. I understand it was incredibly well attended. And we'll continue to use it as a poster which celebrates and champions what floating land can achieve. And people speak really fondly about it as well. And then I speak to the floating land team who was there for the delivery and talk about how the waterfront area was decimated by the number of people who trod all over the native species of plants that were there, and the amount of rubbish that was left behind, and how much it was... I'm sorry to burst everyone's bubble here. It's still a fantastic project and a fantastic thing, but there's these really strange ways that we romanticise things through images as well, and all the negative stuff slips away and all the positive stuff sticks with the image. But it had such an impact on so many people, and the image continues to do so, and it's what we can use to lure people in who haven't experienced floating land before to come in and check it out. But then I contrast that with, and I'll wrap this up really quickly, for me, that project had so many eyes on it, but I was privileged enough to experience a project in my first floating land in 2019, which only had a really limited number of eyes on it and was just as significant, that involved First Nations artists. And that was, we invited Bianca Beatson to do a project with Leah Davis out at Murdering Creek. And it was a really powerful project that dealt with the horrendous history of murder and massacre that happened at that site. Now, Leah works with contact mics and hydrophones to really tap into the sounds of the natural environment. And Bianca was collaborating with her to engage with the site and stream sound from the site live back into the Noosa Regional Gallery so that people could have an understanding of what it was like to be out there without actually being out there. We didn't actually invite people out to the site. But coinciding with that, I delved back into the history of floating land and was kind of made aware there was a young artist who came out in an early floating land named Masao Akabe from Japan, and he did his first community collaborative project out here in Noosa as part of Floating Land, and went on to make a career out of that. He's represented Japan at the Venice Biennale. He's collected by Mona, and I invited him out here, managed to get in contact with him and his collaborative partner Chihiro Minato. He came out here and met with David Walsh at Mona at the tail end of Floating Land that year. But I was telling Masao and Chihiro about Bianca's and Leah's project out of Murdering Creek, and Bianca invited me to bring them out there. So it was just an audience of the three of us with Bianca and Leah. And Bianca pointed out a scar tree, and Masao's practice is all about frottage and taking rubbings of surfaces, and he had his paper and his charcoal with him. And he asked Bianca permission to take a rubbing of this scar tree, and Bianca said yes, absolutely. So and Leah had her hydrophones and her contact mics with her and told Masao that she could actually let him hear the circulatory system of this tree with the contact microphones and the headphones. So I've got this really crappy iPhone footage of myself filming Masao Akabe, this artist from Japan, taking a rubbing of a scar tree that a traditional owner gave him permission to do, while he listened to the circulatory system by the equipment provided by Leah Barclay, and it was just me who got to witness it, and it wasn't planned, and it's fantastic. And I think those kinds of projects are just as significant as the ones which you can use for marketing purposes for years to come.
I'm so far back that I started it that I kind of keep forgetting, but we did invite a number of Korean artists and also a German artist, but at that stage it was one of our projects, and I can't remember which one it was now, where we didn't have enough money, because when we first started we got government grants and so forth, but the next one we had to work on this process of getting people into other projects, then into Australia, doing from their funding to come to ours. But this particular one, we had these artists working at the Steiner School where my children were studying in Noosa Pengari. And they ended up making, this is a really nice story about community. They ended up making, one of them carved all these beautiful shapes of wood for the preschool area, and then another one built this dragon tail at the start of the school where you came in. Another one built the kids always used to play in the bush there. Noosa's Pengari School is very much about making and using your hands and the bush. This particular artist made this whole cocoon in the bush where the kids could go into and play. So that was a nice way of getting them to do one project before they did Floating Land by funding that. And the school got that money together to pay for them to come.
It's really nice to hear about some of these artworks that have existed in the past, because my first experience of Floating Land was the clay kilns out at Lake Tharabar when I first moved to the region in 2007. So, and there was a lot of people there. I remember that. It brings me to my next question, I think, which is about this ephemeral nature of the art that is usually part of Floating Land. And I think, it's obviously created in the site, and then sometimes it can be erased by the elements or even the fauna that as we're experiencing currently. So I suppose I'm interested in the desire or the balance between legacy and lasting impact and that ephemerality. Any of you?
You want to start?
I don't think, I've never really had the conversation with any curators or academics, so I'm not sure if it's a thing, but I've kind of built a distinction in my mind between ephemeral art and temporary art. Even though ephemeral art is a kind of temporary art, I think, for me, ephemeral art is a kind of practice where the work kind of dissolves of its own accord. whereas temporary art can have a bit more intervention by the artist to remove it, and it's relevant at a site for a short period of time. That's not the question you asked though, but for both of those kinds of projects, this is just a really kind of practical thing for me. From the start, I put in quite a lot of resources, financial resources and human resources into documenting what we do really well. We rely on Arts Queensland funding and have for the last 3 flooding lands to deliver it at that scale, and they give us about $70,000 or $80,000, which is quite significant. And I write a proposal in amongst all those other arts organisations across Queensland who are in for that money, saying we're going to do this event, and I don't know who any of the artists are yet, and I don't know any of the locations, and I don't know what any of the artworks are going to be. Can I have a big chunk of cash? And I put our success down to the fact that we document the projects from the previous ones really well, and we put a lot of money into developing a catalogue which writes about those projects and shines those projects in their best light, because that's the document that I can give to them to say, this is what we're going to do, trust us.
The very first one that we did get a reasonable grant, but we didn't have catalogues, but we wrote to, what was it, Vogue Living, I think it was?
Vogue.
I know, yeah, it's crazy, but we wrote to I put this whole package together of all the proposals, and I sent it to every magazine, newspaper, and then Vogue Living said, oh, we want to do a 10-page spread. And I said, oh, that'd be nice. But in terms of ephemerality, they came before all the works were made. So then they started trying to take photographs of the sites and maybe some drawings, but it was quite interesting how they tried to interpret this project. And it was that was probably the best example of ephemerality, because the projects hadn't even been made, and they were documenting them. But I think I agree with Michael. I think it is about those two distinct things. And I never really thought about that, but I guess what's been happening, it started to happen in the second flooding land, where it was all about technology and performance, as opposed to people making objects. So all the projects were about projections, or using those road signs that we see where we've got, work starting between this time and this time, where an artist actually did text on those signs, or there were kind of performances with lights flashing between mountains, and lights on costumes, and it was quite performative. No objects, no work was made in that particular floating land that was an object. It was all performative work. So, it depends on the times. I think even my partner did a project for floating land. I think that was 2023, but using what do you call it? Sorry, where you can look at a screen and you can see, you hold it in front of something. Augmented, sorry. Where she did this work with the oceans rising and so forth. It just showed another view of the possible future. And I think, artists are using different materials all the time, but technology is going to be an interesting one as we go forward, I think, in terms of all the AI stuff that's happening and so forth. What effect will that have on these kind of projects? Will people just retreat back into objects, and whether it's ephemeral or whether it's an object made? I don't know. It'll be interesting to see.